Everywhere we look, democracy seems to be in trouble. Only you can protect democracy. Welcome to Section 1 and 2 S.I.D.E, Students in Democracy Education. 10 fundamental principles of liberal democracy and 10 conversations. Let's get started. Well, welcome to S.I.D.E and to your conversation about the reasonable limits principle. And here's how it goes. Any limitations on the preceding fundamentals are permissible only to the extent that they safeguard and advance the causes of justice, freedom, and democracy. So what does this mean? We know that in civil society, there will be a competition between citizens for scarce resources. In the same way, there is a competition from time to time between citizens over the exercise of their fundamental rights and freedoms. Sometimes the exercise of one person's fundamental rights and freedoms bumps into another person's fundamental rights and freedoms. When that occurs, we have to figure out how to balance those competing interests. We have to figure out how to give effect to everyone's fundamental rights and freedoms while recognizing that we will have to curtail them in some way from time to time in a manner that is fair and that respects the whole regime or system of rights and freedoms. But not only do we have contests of rights and freedoms, we also have a larger contest between society's general interests and the individual rights and freedoms. From time to time, a societal goal, a public policy of national importance will require the restriction on the exercise of individual or group rights and freedoms. Not because the goal is ever about restricting the freedoms or the rights themselves, but rather because achieving the national purpose, the public policy, giving expression to the national interest will sometimes have the effect, a kind of collateral damage, if you will, of limiting or restricting the exercise of rights and freedoms. It's unavoidable. This occurs in every society. But the difference between a free and democratic society, a just society, and other systems of government, other types of societal arrangements, for example, dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, or autocracies, is that in those other systems of government, the limitation on rights and freedoms occurs as a matter of course, often without regard to the rights and freedoms that are being restricted. In a free and democratic society, in a liberal democracy, anytime the government restricts rights or limits rights or curtails rights and freedoms, it has to do it in a way that respects the very rights and freedoms that are being limited or curtailed. That may seem like a bit of a paradox, like a bit of an internal contradiction, but it's not. This reasonable limits principle does not impose an outright denial of the fundamental principles that we've discussed in our side conversations. It doesn't express a denial of the fundamental rights and freedoms of individual citizens and of groups in society, so long as it can be justified as actually respecting and defending the system of rights and freedoms itself. The principle is embodied in Section 1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Constitution. That's where our organization, Section 1, took its inspiration. Section 1 of the Charter says that the rights and freedoms in the Charter are guaranteed subject only to such reasonable limits as prescribed by law and demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So let's look at an example of how rights limitations might be justified in order to comply with this 10th fundamental, this reasonable limits principle. It could be a situation where the government is responding to a national emergency. It could be a situation where the government has some very important national economic or industrial strategy that it wants to advance and further in the national interest, which may have an adverse impact on the exercise of some individual rights, be it language rights. We've seen that in Quebec, where the government has sought to protect the French language and the distinct Quebec culture, with the consequence of restricting the rights of allophones, of those who speak other languages. We see it in situations where there's a need to extract natural resources for the national good, for the public good, or simply to advance an important economic interest, but where that extraction and exploitation of natural resources may have an adverse effect on Aboriginal rights, on the rights of other citizens by the pursuit of that national interest or of that other public purpose. So we have to figure out how to manage that competition of rights and interests in a way that does as little violence as possible to anyone's fundamental rights and freedoms. Our governments and legislatures are often the first institutions to establish some regime of priorities and restrictions in order to manage this kind of problem. And often they'll identify a policy objective, a political goal, or an important societal interest that they want to advance, but that may also result in restricting or limiting some of the rights and freedoms of certain individuals. The government may want to protect citizens from being the targets of hate speech, but in enacting a law that punishes hate speech, it is thereby restricting what people may be allowed to say or to communicate, and therefore it limits someone's freedom of expression. Or perhaps a government wishes to ensure that no person may be denied services based on their sexual orientation or gender identification, but in requiring that all businesses provide their services to any person, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identification, as a matter of fundamental equality rights, the government may in fact be compelling someone or some group to act in contrary to their religious beliefs, thereby impairing or restricting freedom of religion. These sorts of predicaments arise all the time, and they generally require some guidance and some direction from our courts, from our independent judiciary, in order that we might understand how to proceed, in order that we might know which restrictions on our fundamental rights and freedoms can be justified and which laws ought to be struck down or invalidated because the infringement or violation of fundamental rights and freedoms cannot be justified under any circumstances. But what is the test for determining whether a limitation or a restriction on any of these fundamentals can be justified so as to meet the threshold required by the reasonable limits principle? This is how we might answer that question. First of all, the restriction has to be clear, well articulated, understandable to everyone. There can't be any secret about what it is and what its purported effect might be on our rights and freedoms. And it must recognize that one or more of these fundamentals are in fact being restricted. This is achieved by ensuring that governments in a free and democratic society, in a liberal democracy, make every effort to achieve their broad purpose or objective in a rational way, in a way that demonstrates a real, rational, sensible connection between the purpose and the means used to achieve that purpose. It also requires that the purpose itself be an important one, be a generally recognized and acknowledged important public purpose. Rights, freedoms, and the principles of liberal democracy, the Section 1 fundamentals that we're talking about, cannot be overridden, restricted, limited, curtailed, or abridged for trivial purposes. It's also important that the government demonstrate that the policy itself restricts rights and freedoms and the fundamentals of liberal democracy themselves as little as possible. We call this the minimal impairment test. So we recognize that from time to time, we will act as a society in the name of society in ways that unavoidably compromise some interests protected or advanced by these various fundamental principles. The reasonable limits principle acknowledges this inescapable, unavoidable reality, and it reminds us of the conditions under which some of those compromises can be defended and justified. And if they can't be, because they simply don't satisfy the requirements or the standards of the reasonable limits principle, then they just don't pass. They're not permitted. Now it's your turn. With this conversation, you will have completed 10 side conversations. You will have discussed and explored some of the most important principles that underpin what we call a free and democratic society. You will have discussed the indispensable heroic citizen principle, the equality principle, the fair distribution principle, the pluralism principle, the apostasy principle, the truth principle, the rule of law principle, the self-determination principle, the counter-majoritarianism principle, and the reasonable limits principle. Congratulations to you for having undertaken this project. I know that you will be and that you will feel better informed, better able to think about the great challenges involved in protecting a free and democratic society. So now, over to you for your conversation about the reasonable limits principle. And I know that your society will be measurably better off because you've taken the time and made the effort to have these 10 conversations.